I'm going to start with a non-Italian example, but I think it's a good one. It's in Spain. In 1574, Ambrosio de Morales, who you can see here, a historian from Cordova, published a selection of works connected to St. Eulogius. Like Morales, Eulogius had been a Cordoban with historical interests. In 859, he had been arrested for hiding a Muslim convert to Christianity. While in jail, before being martyred himself, he had written his thoughts about earlier Cordoban martyrs who had met their fate under the Roman Empire. Morales included these commentaries in his edition of Eulogius's work, and he added his own treatise on the Roman history of the city. His treatise demonstrated the prominence of Roman remains, including inscriptions, which you can see on the right, pointing to Cordoba's pre-Muslim importance as a Roman and then Christian city. So that was in 1574. By a happy coincidence, in 1575, material proof for some of this picture came to light. As a subsequent report had it, on November 21st, while excavating beneath the floor of the church of San Pedro, a thick stone sepulchre with some inscriptions was found. The inscriptions appeared to mention the presence of the martyred saints of Jesus Christ, Faustus, Januarius, Marcial, etc. Morales was invited to assess this, and this is an extract from Morales' report with his picture of the inscription. This new evidence joined up some dots. In his treatise, Morales had recorded the names of various Cordoban martyrs killed in the Great Persecution under Diocletian, including Faustus, Januarius, and Martial. In his commentaries, Eulogius had mentioned a basilica dedicated to these three saints, which held their remains. The discovery of the inscription and the bones in San Pedro therefore gave weight to these two accounts, as well as connecting the present-day church to moments of great importance in the city's Christian history. A provincial council soon ruled that this tomb's contents included relics of the saints, and therefore that they had to be celebrated by all Christians. Pretty soon, they were installed at the altar, and the church is still proud of them today. So that's an inscription from 1909, recording them, and a close-up of the altar. You don't have to be a dour 21st century historian to find all this a bit convenient. And in the 17th century, questions were already raised. But stepping back a bit, the initial publication, discovery, and display offers a good example of the ways in which people tried to uncover and reveal the truth in this period. First, objects provided proof for written assertions, not so much the bones as the old-looking sarcophagus and the old-looking inscriptions that were on it. Old objects provided a compelling level of testimony that written texts, subject to copyist whims, struggled to reach. 16th century historians of ancient Rome had argued that objects revealed the truth of events. Both Christian worshippers and historians valued the tangible presence of relics from the past. Second, it was Morales, a historian, who had the expertise to interpret, contextualize, and explain the material remains that turned up. His work on the antiquity of Cordova had demonstrated his authority already. He knew his textual sources intimately, and he could supplement written references to the ancient city with what he learnt from the physical remains. He went on to write about the antiquities of the whole of Spain as historian to the King of Spain, in which he analyzed textual references and archaeology from across the kingdom. In most cases, scholars like Morales had dealt with survivals from the pagan Roman world. But, and this is the third point, in the aftermath of the Council of Trent, with the new impetus given to the study of Christian history, people used to dealing with Roman texts and objects turned their hand to Christian testimony. As we've seen, they could demonstrate the continuity of certain practices, especially the use of images in churches. And then, especially after 1588, when the Congregation of Rites and Ceremonies was established in Rome to document and regulate the cult of the saints, historians could provide details of local Christian histories and ceremonies. In particular, they demonstrated the ancient existence of Christian communities, evidence for bishops across the centuries, and the early origins of cults of saints. Cesare Baronio, who was working on the Roman martyrology and his history of the church, was eager for reliable testimony. This new shift to the ancient history of the church is best attested at Rome. In Rome, there are plenty of antiquities, such as wellheads, plenty of budding scholars, and plenty of patrons like Barberini. Outside the city, though, it's a bit less well known, and I've been trying to find out how extensive interventions like that of Morales were. There's a little less than I expected. On the one hand, early Christian artifacts in the Western Roman Empire were often not terribly impressive or informative. On the other hand, early Christian texts, including saints' lives, could be quite vague about the contexts in which their narratives took place, and so detailed knowledge about Roman sources wasn't so helpful in explaining them. But there are still plenty of examples of cases where scholars turned their hand to local history and showed that the techniques of the historians of Rome could help them make their point. It's less the art of the title of this conference and more the objects of history. I'm a historian, and I'm afraid that my images are rather miserable in comparison to what's come before. But I hope I can give you an idea of the historical cultures in which the post-Tridentine artists worked that lies behind much of what we've already heard. So, first, another couple of simple cases from outside the Italian peninsula. The Aliscamp, the ancient cemetery of Arles in Provence, was well known as a pilgrimage site, but it had been neglected in the Renaissance. In the early 17th century, the archbishop gave it to a religious order with the proviso that the friars should maintain the site. They collected antiquities, restored the church, and provided access to the crypt. In the crypt were the tombs of several 4th century bishops, and unfortunately this one's been moved to the museum, but you get an idea. The archbishop then commissioned a man called Pierre Saxi to write a history of the church in Arles, supported by the evidence of the tombs. Oops, sorry. That's that one. Saxi documented an unbroken series of bishops, beginning with St. Trophimus in the 3rd century to the present day. Scholars could also use their knowledge to defend and explain early Christian texts, especially saints' lives. Marcus Valsa was a banker, local historian, and patron of Galileo in Augsburg. He edited the Passion of St. Afra, who was martyred in the city during Diocletian's great persecution. Valsa argued that the style of the text and its convincing references to Roman legal norms demonstrated that it was written soon after the event, unlike many lives of saints, and because it was written soon after the event, it was more authoritative. Her tomb here on the right was first recorded in the abbey that bears her name today in the 11th century. To Roman historians, this would raise red flags. First, Roman cemeteries were outside the city walls. Second, Afra's life said that she was buried 2 miles from where she died. But Valsa said that he had found a body by the wall of this church which still had a nail in its hand, showing that martyrs had indeed been buried there, and so he was willing to believe that this was indeed her tomb. Turning to Italy. Between about 1580 and 1650, we find an enormous flood of editions of saints' lives and of local histories. The lives were not usually editions of early texts, such as Valsa's, but biographies based on lots of testimony. The histories typically discuss life under the Romans and then the arrival of Christianity before moving forward. We can find interesting examples from across the top of the peninsula, and you know where these places are, but I'm going to show you just so you can see how widespread it was. Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, Pavia, Vercelli, etc., etc. There are many others. Reading these works today is a disorienting experience. In some ways, they seem very modern. They're attentive to questions of evidence and often quietly adversarial. In others, they seem very distant. They have no footnotes, and so they address their questions at bewildering length in the text, citing sources at length, and they engage in skirmishes of great insignificance. Skeptical one minute, they appear credulous the next, trying to connect their towns to the sons of Noah or heroes of the Trojan War or distant saints. In this mass of citation and digression and argumentation, a little knowledge of the ancient Roman past or of Roman-era remains could help authors make their points. So here are some examples. In Vercelli, after Trent, the bishop organized the building of a new cathedral on the site of the crumbling Paleo-Christian basilica. In the course of this work, in 1581, the tomb of St Eusebius was discovered. And you can kind of tell, I haven't actually been to see it. This is the best photo I could find. Eusebius was believed to be the first bishop of Vercelli in the 4th century. His remains then became the foundation for an unbroken history of the bishops, like the example we saw from Arles. In Pavia, a few years before, Antonio Maria Spelter had produced a similar work, charting all the bishops from the year 45 to the present. His was more politically charged. He entered into a long-standing debate about whether and how the bishops of Pavia should be subordinate to the archbishops of Milan. Inhabitants of Pavia, needless to say, valued their religious autonomy. One way to argue for it was to demonstrate the antiquity and independence of the bishops of Pavia, and hence Spelter's argument that the first bishop of Pavia, San Siro, took office in 45, not long after Jesus' crucifixion. Offering much proof for the existence of the early bishops was understandably tricky. But Spelter could give an impression of diligence and authority by finding the suitably antique tombs of later bishops. One historical problem was a certain San Dalmazzo, martyred by the Romans in the 3rd century, who, according to some accounts, was supposed to have been bishop of Pavia. The problem was that another tradition claimed that no martyr's blood had ever been shed in the city. So Spelter went off to find his tomb at a place called Quarniento. This allowed him to claim that the people had wanted him to become bishop of Pavia, but he had chosen to preach elsewhere before he was killed. In Pavia itself, Spelter could quote and date this epitaph of a 6th century bishop, Ennodius. In 1573, this tomb had been translated with considerable fanfare to San Michele Maggiore in the city, and thus Spelter's work offered context for that. In Brescia, historians had a different problem. The city's patron saints, martyrs under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, were a pair of brothers called Faustino and Jovita. They were killed at the site of a church called San Faustino ad Sanguinem, known as Sant'Afra by the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, a translation of relics was made to San Faustino Maggiore, the more significant chiesa patronale of the city. Exactly what was involved in this translation, however, was disputed. Both churches claimed to have the bodies, and from the 12th century, when a pair of corpses were found at Sant'Afra, the story arose that there were in fact 2 sets of brothers, Faustino and Jovita Primi and Faustino and Jovita Secondi. After Trent, this situation became embarrassing. When Carlo Borromeo came as apostolic visitor in 1580, as Sant'Afra was about to be restored, he invited the Pope to solve the problem. Gregory XIII tactfully said that reopening the tombs was not necessary, but that people could freely honor the saints in either church, as relics were indeed present at each. Unfortunately, this did not settle the issue. The abbot of Sant'Afra, Ascanio Martinengo, wrote a history of the martyrs in 1598, towing the party line and making clear that some relics of Faustino and Jovita were left behind in his church, but he denied that a second pair could have existed, because if his church had the Secondi, that's not quite as good as having the Primi. Others, though, continued to stress the translation. This is a poor reproduction of what I assume is quite a poor painting by Pietro Maria Bagnatore of that event. And you can see it has a significantly large wagon to translate both corpses there. It's a 1603 copy of a damaged 1526 original. From my point of view, what's interesting about it was that this copy was commissioned by the Comune, who seemed to have been eager to maintain the memory of the translation. The dispute rumbled on. In 1623, the arca containing the bodies in San Faustino Maggiore was opened. 2 more or less intact bodies were found. And this is a drawing of that event from what seems to have been a touch relic box, which is now in the V&A, in which someone would have had the drawing to remind themselves of the tomb and placed in this box something that they had touched to the bones when the tomb was open. These corpses, as you can see, are more or less intact. The exception is there's an arm missing here, but everyone agreed that the arm of Faustino had been sent to Monte Cassino in return for the arm of San Benedetto. Because these bodies are more or less intact, this opening suggested that San Faustino Maggiore did indeed have the originals. A historian called Ottavio Rossi weighed in. Rossi had made his name and won sponsorship from the city with a study of the classical Roman remains of Brescia. Unlike Martinengo, he could discourse carefully about the ancient topography of the city and about the various Roman officials who ran it. He made here plausible suggestions about the aristocratic prominence of Faustino and Giovita's family, where they lived, and where they must have preached the gospel. Having established his authority with careful contextual scholarship, he then swiftly resurrected the story of their secondi, maintaining the same tone, arguing that although they were secondi and martyred later, Brescia and the Church of St. Afra should really be pleased to have them. Whereas Faustino and Giovita had always been honored on February the 15th, he claimed to have found evidence that the secondi had a separate feast day a month later than the primi, and proposed that the city should celebrate both days in the future. In this case, I think we can see how these arguments affected what painters did. The iconography of these saints had traditionally shown them as warriors. In 1438, they were supposed to have protected the city in a siege by the Visconti. But what you see here, for early 17th century representations, make clear to show them not as warriors, but as ordained Christian leaders. And this is because the primi were definitely the Christian leaders, the secondi may have been the knights. It was better to be safe than sorry and show them as the primi. In comparison with these other sites, Milan had many early Christian remains. There was also good textual evidence to go with them, especially a letter from the end of the 4th century that St. Ambrose had written to his sister Marcellina, in which he described the discovery of relics of some saints, which he had transferred to his new basilica, now Sant'Ambrogio. Investigation of this Paleo-Christian testimony began before Trent. Andrea Alciato, who is best known to art historians as the inventor of the emblem, was also a noted legal scholar and historian. Among his projects were various notebooks of inscriptions. One of these was devoted to material from Milan, both pagan and Christian. Some inscriptions he claimed to have seen himself, like this one here, and you can assess the quality of his reproduction with the original on the right. Others he collected from copies that previous scholars had made. One most ancient codex, as he called it, supplied him with a series of early Christian examples. These include some pieces of fundamental importance. For example, Alciato could confirm Ambrose's interest in martyrs with an inscription from his Basilica of the Apostles. This inscription records that Ambrose founded the church in 395 or 396, installed the bones of Saint Nazarius there. Only a couple of the fragments survive, as you can see, and so Alciato's testimony gives us the rest of it. Similarly, he gives an inscription that records that Serena, wife of the warlord Stilicho, added a marble floor in front of the tomb in 402. The Milanese were fervent believers in the story that St. Barnabas, the apostle and one-time companion of St. Paul, traveled across northern Italy before settling in Milan in 53. Alciato wrote histories of the city and of its early churches, but he could only find Barnabas in much later medieval narratives. And so he told the story of Barnabas, but was unable to offer convincing proof for it. But he did have evidence for the achievements of St. Eustorgius, who was the bishop of Milan in the 4th century. Eustorgius supposedly established a basilica on the site where Barnabas baptized the first Milanese. Alciato could show that Eustorgius had been honored with this inscription. And then he went on to kind of discuss what happened there. At this new church, St. Barnabas had apparently turned his converts away from the worship of Mercury. Alciato could show that Mercury was indeed worshipped in Milan. Eustorgius was supposed to have built his basilica over Temple of Hercules. Alciato could show that there were inscriptions to Hercules as well as to Mercury there. The sources that Alciato found provided circumstantial, then, if not direct evidence for the early presence of Barnabas. After Trent, Alciato's collection of inscriptions and his written histories were hugely useful to the series of Milanese writers who demonstrated the religious importance of their city from antiquity to the present. They quoted him, they used his sources, and they expanded his narrative. The absence of anything concrete on Barnabas was notable. So, it's a little surprising to find that Carlo Bascape, friend and supporter of Carlo Borromeo, claimed to have found a couple of inscriptions in Alciato's papers that fleshed out the story. One that he's quoting here recorded the dedication of Barnabas's fountain. And the other was a dedication to Saint Anatolone, Barnabas's disciple who became bishop after his death. Neither of these inscriptions presume to date from the 1st century, when Barnabas and Anatolone were in Milan. They were dedications made by later 4th century bishops, and so evidence at one remove, if you like. But unfortunately, neither seems to be genuine. The language and the format are fishy, and modern historians certainly don't trust them. They were valuable indeed, however, to the Milanese. The first inscription supported Federico Borromeo's restoration of Barnabas's font, as recorded here in 1623. The Anatolone inscription demonstrated that 4th century bishops recognized Anatolone as their distant predecessor as bishop, and was sent to Cesare Baronio in Rome for inclusion in his martyrology. And so that's the details of that are down here. These inscriptions don't survive, however, in the material that we have from Alciato today, and are probably a little crude to have been invented by him. So what happened? I suspect that the late 16th century church historians have piggybacked on Alciato's reputation to provide invented evidence for their local cult. So, to conclude very briefly, these historians made detailed claims for the truth of Christian histories in their towns and cities. To do so, they leaned on their knowledge of the Roman past, and in some cases on the techniques that they'd learned studying Roman texts and remains. They found some new objects, and they recontextualized others. Their work was certainly tendentious. In Brescia, historians argued about cult in the city. In Pavia, Spelter found a first bishop who arrived a few years before, not coincidentally, Barnabas. Alciato even argued that Milan should be exempt from taxation in the 16th century because in the 4th century his man Eustorgius had persuaded the Emperor Constantine to exempt the city then. Their work was also designed to secure the place of their local figures in the general collections that Baronio and others were making at Rome. And there's also, the example above shows that Morales' material got to Baronio and was included there. In some ways then, they offer competing truths. But together, they all try to make a compelling argument for the validity and centrality of historical facts, figures, and practices to post-Tridentine Christianity, and in that they concord. Thank you.